Welcome back. This is Jeff Hix, curator of the Strange As It Seems archives and grandnephew of John Hix, who created Strange As It Seems back in the late 1920s. Last week we covered the John Hix era on all the stories about Abraham Lincoln that I could find in this Abraham Lincoln file in the Strange As It Seems archives. And this week we'll move forward into the era of Ernest Hix and Elsie Hix and continue on with all the strange and unusual facts and information on Abraham Lincoln. Let's dive back in. And moving on into the era of Ernest Hix, John Hix's brother, my grandfather, who took over after John Hix passed away of myocarditis, actually. He died on D-Day, which was interesting. June 6th, 1944. It had nothing to do with the war. It just happened to be coincidentally on that same day, and Ernest Hix took over. And it looks like a ton of comic strips just over the 4 years that Ernest Hix ran the comic strip. Apparently he loved facts about Abraham Lincoln. Here's one about Abraham Lincoln when he was president. He could still hold an axe at arm's length. And I love this in the notes here. In parentheses, it says, try it. So apparently an amazing feat that Abraham Lincoln could still do as president. He had also worn out by the appeals of two rival seekers for a minor office. Apparently, Lincoln weighed their petition papers and appointed the man whose preferences were the heavier. Interesting little fact about Abraham Lincoln here by Ernest Hix. Here's another one. As a young man, Abe Lincoln could pick up a full barrel of water and drink from the bunghole of the barrel. Crazy. Reported by people who saw him do it in contests of strength and skill, which apparently at one time he was quite fond of entering. And one of my favorite jokes, stupid jokes my dad was a big fan of course, dad jokes told by your dad. But my dad used to tell this joke about, he goes, well, you know I was named after Abraham Lincoln. I said, your name's Ernest Hix. It's Ernest Hix Jr., same as my grandfather. And I said, you were named after Abraham Lincoln? He said, well, I didn't say I was named before him. And a bunch more here from the Ernest Hix Sr. era. Apparently the president applauded his own murderer. In October of 1864, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater before he was assassinated, and apparently vigorously applauded the young star, John Wilkes Booth, who 6 months later was to kill him in the same theater. Strange as it seems. And here's a Strange as it seems from February 12th, which was widely recognized as Abraham Lincoln's birthday. Back in the day, I remember when we had a Monday off for Lincoln's birthday and a Monday off for Washington's birthday, and then it became President's Day. But every February 12th, oftentimes, strange as it seems, we just kind of dedicate the entire day to Abraham Lincoln in the comic strip, and that's what they did here on February 12th. And this is an interesting one, that Abraham Lincoln once saved a man's life with a Farmers Almanac. He discredited, when he was a lawyer, he discredited the testimony of a key witness in a murder trial. The witness said that he swore he saw the crime committed by moonlight, and Abraham Lincoln brought out the Farmers Almanac and showed that there was no moonlight at the time in question. Strange as it seems. And another one that might be a little known fact, that Abraham Lincoln's three brothers-in-law, Mary Todd Lincoln, his wife's brothers, they all fought and died for the Confederacy. And while away, it's just kind of interesting, another fact that involved Mrs. Lincoln, but while Lincoln was absent from Springfield, Mrs. Lincoln apparently had their home completely remodeled. And when he returned, he didn't even recognize his own home, and he actually was asking neighbors, where does Abraham Lincoln live? Strange as it seems. Continuing on in the Ernest Hix era, apparently Abraham Lincoln was kind of an air-minded president. We did a episode not too long ago on dirigibles and on the blimps, and apparently there was a man named Dr. Solomon Andrews, quite an enthusiast about dirigibles, and he had plans for a war dirigible and that he submitted to Congress, but apparently the red tape held it up, even though Abraham Lincoln was supporting the idea of a dirigible to be used in the Civil War. And another one from the Ernest Hix era, he likes so much he actually published it twice during his 4-year term running the comic strip. But it was about the Raven clan of the Tungats of Alaska. Before the Alaskan Purchase, they were suffering as slaves from a nearby clan. And upon learning that the practice of slavery was now illegal once Alaska became a state, they erected a 50-foot totem pole with Lincoln at the top. Strange as it seems. And as we know, each president typically pardons a turkey at Thanksgiving, but apparently the first one to do it was Abraham Lincoln. The kindness and consideration of animals of Abraham Lincoln as a boy is well known, but not so well known as the same love for animals displayed by his son Tad. An admirer of President Lincoln had sent a very fine fat turkey gobbler to the White House for Thanksgiving. Since the event was quite a way off, Tad undertook to feed the splendid creature, and basically the turkey took a liking to Tad and followed him about all over the White House grounds. And when Thanksgiving at last was so near, the preparations were being made for the dinner, Tad could no longer bear the idea of his fine feathered friend being dished up on a platter. So it was that the President of the United States was in a serious conference with one of his youngest subjects, who with tearful eyes begged for the life of his admired friend. And the president could not refuse the request, and many minutes later the youngster dashed wildly into the kitchen, waving in his hands something that he thrust into the hand of the startled cook. And it was a full and unconditional pardon, whereby the life of the turkey gobbler was spared, document signed by the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, strange as it seems. And for a really interesting story about Abraham Lincoln, by the way, that begins with his son Tad on the floor of the White House, check out the archives below. We have a 1937 film, Columbia Pictures, on Abraham Lincoln that shows Abraham Lincoln with Seward and also with Tad on the floor, being represented by actors, of course, but a really interesting, strange as it seems, film on Abraham Lincoln as well here in the archives. And the transition era, after my grandfather Ernest Hix died in a plane crash, strange as it seems, went just by Hix for a little while as my grandmother Elsie took over it. She didn't put her name on it right away, but we did have an interesting fact during this period that on, of course, February 12th of 1949, the year after Ernest Hix passed away in the plane crash. But in 1948, apparently due to his strong opposition to the Mexican War, Lincoln thought he had absolutely no political future, strange as it seems. And moving into the 1950s, in the era of Elsie Hix, as she took over the comic strip for Ernest Hix, she actually ran it for several years, in fact, almost 20 years, that Elsie Hix kept the comic strip going. But one of the very first ones, and I heard this story many times, which is really fascinating story, but apparently Abraham Lincoln had a prophetic dream about his own death. Shortly before his assassination, Abraham Lincoln dreamed he saw a casket, and he asked what was in it in the dream, and the guard answered, the president. Previously, he had dreamed of 7 Civil War battles before they also took place, and also the surrender of Robert E. Lee. Amazing, but Lincoln dreaming of his own death, strange as it seems. And although we talked about the assassination attempts, those weren't the only attempts made on Lincoln's life. And apparently, as a youth of 19 years old, while on a trip to New Orleans, as a hired hand on a flatboat, 7 river bandits attacked him with the intent of killing him and stealing the cargo. And basically a ferocious fight ensued, and Lincoln carried a deep scar on his head from that fight for the rest of his life, strange as it seems. And another one from, looks like 1954, from the Elsie Hix era. Crazy, but during, apparently at the time of Lincoln's inauguration, 5 ex-presidents were alive: Van Buren, Tyler, Fillmore, Pierce, and Buchanan. And there were also, at the occasion, 4 future presidents: Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, and Benjamin Harris. Amazing. This was apparently started by John Hix was the first one to print this, but Elsie carried it again in the 1950s. The greatest number of American ex-presidents alive at the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln. And a few from the late 1960s, as my grandma Elsie was handing over the comic strip to my parents, Ernest and Phyllis Hix. But Elsie Hix here had a strange and unusual, this is 1968 by Elsie Hix. Before becoming the 16th president of the U.S., Abraham Lincoln lost an election for Congress, 2 elections for Senate, was rejected as a Republican vice presidential candidate, and received only 40% of the popular vote, as we covered before, when elected president. And then here we have, from the era of Ernest and Phyllis Hix, one of the comic strips from the very tail end of Strange as It Seems, about the Lincoln Memorial. The 36 columns around the colonnade of the Lincoln Memorial are not vertical. They tilt inward, as does the outer facade of the building above them, and that eliminates the optical illusion of the building bulging at the top, strange as it seems. And for one of those wow facts that Strange as It Seems was known for publishing, it first started in 1935. John Hix published this fact that the Emancipation Proclamation, the most famous document of Lincoln's presidency, did not free a single slave. Elsie published this again in the 1950s, that it did not. In fact, in the Sunday Comics, most famous document, did not free a single slave. And this created quite a stir. In fact, there's a whole pile of handwritten letters here to my grandma Elsie. Dear Miss Hix, I'm in the 8th grade of Elizabeth Junior High, but she, as well as Phyllis Olensky, Bobby Wallace, here's a letter from Walter Smith, all the challenges that were made to Elsie Hix and to Strange as It Seems. And in her letters, she responded to each and every one of them individually, as was the custom of Strange as It Seems, to back up every fact. And she wrote that in replying to your letter, I'm quoting from the American Encyclopedia as follows. The curious feature of this proclamation is that it abolished slavery only in the sections not under the military power of the United States, and left it untouched in those which were, namely the ones specifically accepted by it, which are for the present left precisely as if this proclamation were not issued. Hence, it was argued that it had no legal force whatsoever and emancipated no one. Strange as it seems. And here from 1935, just going back to the notes from John Hix, that really clarified all of this. But the Emancipation Proclamation issued by President Lincoln during the Civil War is, to the popular mind, perhaps the most famous document issued by the president during the entire war. Yet, strange as it seems, the Emancipation Proclamation, which many times described as the order that freed the slaves, did not free a single slave when it was issued. The order affected only those parts of the United States which were then under the control of the Confederacy. Hence, it could not be enforced by the federal government. It did not include any of the land which was at the time under the Union's control. The effect of the proclamation, however, was far-reaching as a statement of policy on the part of Lincoln, and it was noteworthy because it brought the slave issue to the front and thereby made intervention by France or Great Britain on behalf of the South impossible. Interesting. Neither of these European powers could involve itself against the North after the North had, by the proclamation, changed the war into a crusade against slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation was announced by Lincoln in September of 1862. He ordered the revolting states to return to the Union and said that he would free all slaves in any states which had not returned to the Union by the first of the following year. Of course, none of the states followed the order, and so the proclamation was issued. As president, Lincoln did not have the legal right to issue it. As commander-in-chief of the U.S. Army, he had the right to issue it, but not the power to enforce it. As the Union line advanced into Southern territory, however, the slaves were then freed. Strange as it seems. Well, that wraps up this week's episode. on the strange and unusual facts we found this week in the file on Abraham Lincoln. If you like interesting facts like this and strange, unusual facts from history, mined from the Strange as It Seems archives, please hit like, hit the bell to subscribe, drop me a line, and stay tuned for next week when we return for another episode of Strange as It Seems.